this motion is not China should stop having foreign policy, right? The motion is that they should specifically stop looking for influence over other states by exerting pressure over them. What we say is that therefore, first of all, other more extreme forms of exerting pressure over these states definitely fall under the definition of this motion, because, I mean, whether you put pressure through information or through putting an army at someone's door, we say that is both political expansionism in itself. What we say is less extreme forms of expansionism to some extent might still occur, as opening government says, but we say all the forms that they lose are going to be replaced by internal investment within the country, within rural China itself. We say that is something that is hugely important for the Chinese people. Context. What are the Chinese people actually? Because that is who we are trying to defend within this motion, right? What we say is the majority of China still is the rural population. The 800 million people in China still living below the poverty line. The question is, how are these people helped the best sort of within this debate? What we're arguing is that the opportunity cost of sort of political expansionism mean that these people are neglected and not helped. First, several points of rebuttal that are extraneous, the rest will be integrated. First of all, the idea that you expand because of resource extraction, and that is something that is sort of very good. We say resource extraction is not really the reason why China is expanding in the first place. Why? Because they first of all can already buy them on the market, and that is probably cheaper than building an infrastructure in order to be able to get these yourself or be able to extract these from the ground yourself. But second of all, rural China still has a lot of resources themselves that have been untouched by Chinese companies that you can access to. But also note that the Chinese economy in general is moving more in general towards the service sector, for example. So therefore we say it is not necessarily clear why that is so incredibly essential for these companies. Then they say, well, the reason why money trickles down is because otherwise there would be revolution and that would have huge costs. Note, I mean, if you look at China right now, that's just a very unrealistic representation of the situation, right? The government has a very, very strict grip over the people in itself. They don't necessarily need to reinvest because, for example, they have such strong levels of propaganda, they have such strong control over most regions that they don't necessarily need to provide economic benefits to its people in the first place. What we're saying is something different, and now I'm moving into constructives. What we're saying is that the most important area of political expansionism is investment by these huge businesses looking for selling markets, looking for cheap means of production. Why they would still do so, but within Chinese borders, why that would be better for the people. Context. The reasons for investment are twofold. First of all, cheap means of production for business. The fact that land is very cheap, the fact that labor is very cheap, which means you can produce your products actually super cheaply. Note that these can equally be found in rural China, where you still have very poor areas with people that don't have a lot of jobs, still have a lot of labor that is untouched, still have a lot of land that isn't used right now. So therefore we say that is probably a place where they would be looking for investment in the first place. Second of all, the second reason why they invest is connecting to new markets to actually sell, new selling markets. But note that these can also be found twofold. First of all, in these same rural areas that are very poor, but second of all, the areas that to some extent have been developed still have massive growth. Only the southeast coast of China is actually the area that is very rich, that is very developed, but the rest of the huge country that exists still have a lot of places where you can create new markets or upgrade the markets to the extent that you can extract way more wealth from these markets. The veil that they're holding up is economic growth. But the reality is that there are elite interests that are driving China to actually make these investments within these poorer countries. First of all, because they are marginally cheaper for businesses, and since they don't give a crap, that means that it's better for them to move towards them. But second of all, military and strategic interests of the government that we say aren't necessarily beneficial for the people itself, but more for holding the Chinese government that is there now in power. Hence, what we say is because they're looking to expand for cheap means of production, and because they're looking for new selling markets, forms of investment would still occur on our side of the house, but would remain within China because they are still highly profitable there. Why are these so much better than on their side of the house? Twofold. First of all, the current forms of investment simply don't benefit the people on the ground. First of all, because it is so expensive to actually move your operations overseas that there's only access for the very large corporations which are held by the economic elite in the first place. But second of all, note that the selling markets, for example in Africa, where there's a lot of expansionism as well, have almost unlimited growth potential, which means that all the reinvestment that these corporations do actually takes place within those continents themselves and never goes actually back to China.
because they have so much to grow and so much to gain there. So therefore we say the money is exclusively profits which go to the top of the company, and all other sources of revenue go back into those countries within Africa. Now, why would other forms of investment massively benefit the Chinese people on the ground? First of all, directly. Simply access to jobs, access to the labor market. We say that there's a huge source of investment in the first place. But second of all, the fact that companies moving into these poor areas means they build infrastructure. First of all, physical, the fact that they build roads, etc., etc. We say that's something that's hugely important because that provides transport to these people, which is first of all just nice in a general way, but second of all essential for economic growth. But second of all, other forms of infrastructure, electricity, internet, water, all that kind of stuff which is hugely important for those people. We say first of all, even if there's a little bit less of economic growth, the fact that they get access to this is way more valuable for the actual Chinese people on the ground than a little bit of extra money for the government. But second of all, we say it leads to economic upgrade of these regions, which is hugely important as well. No. Second of all, indirect forms of investment or indirect sort of benefits of these investments too. The fact that these economic elites get an interest in developing these regions means they are going to put pressure on the government, are going to put pressure on the party to care more about these poorer areas, to invest more within them. So it's not just business investment, it is also government investment, which would increase under our side of the house. That is hugely important. Why does it occur less under their side of the house? First of all, for the simple reason that investment is, to some extent, a zero-sum game. You only need a limited number of factories to, for example, produce your goods. It is either there or somewhere else. Doing it in Africa means you're not doing it in China. Second of all, these corporations simply don't have unlimited capital. These are hugely expensive factories to build, hugely expensive investments. Think about the $1 trillion Belt and Road investment. It is either a harbor in Somalia or a harbor in northeast China. Second reason why they occur less is because they simply cannot focus on all areas at the same time. Corporations and the government do need to make a choice where they're going to look at, whether they're going to focus on developing an area and doing it as well as they can, or doing it with a different area. They're never going to split this over different places. Second of all, we say there is going to be international backlash which leads to sanctions under their side of the house. We already see this in the status quo, where the West is well, I mean, Marika's going to do that point, I guess. But what I would say is important to take into account is that these forms of expansionism aren't necessarily beneficial. Why? Because they trigger increased investment from the West as well, because they're competing over the latest selling markets that still exist within Africa. Hence, it's simply a collective action problem where they're not really benefiting. Incredibly proud to stand in opposition.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition.
becoming better, having a better position on the international market. We think that on both sides of the house, we have different definitions of what the Chinese people actually are, right? Dave and I talked to you about the 800 million people still living in poverty, despite the fact that China has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, right? We say this is no coincidence. We say even though China might become richer, that money does not go to the actual Chinese people, or at least not to the majority of them, right? We explained to you that they are much more likely to get investment from, for example, companies who will exploit those lands and, for example, actually bring labor to those markets. We say that is much, much more likely on our side of the house when China has not made it incredibly easy for these companies to go to, for example, Africa or to Southeast Asia. We say that is the big problem in this debate. We say we rise people out of poverty. They do not. In my speech, first some rebuttal. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the international backlash that China does face in the status quo, but is going to face even more, and then a little bit more about what they do. So first of all, they say no. The alternative is aggressive regional expansion through military action, right? First of all, both speakers in their own speeches already say that China wants to seem like the moderate good guy, that China wants to seem like the person who is actually doing the good thing, doesn't want to seem hugely aggressive, etc., right? We say their own analysis already proves why China isn't very likely to suddenly become massively aggressive the moment that they don't do political expansionism, right? What we think is much more likely is that they still close trade deals, they still, for example, have friendly relationships with other countries, just like, for example, the USA does, for example, or the EU does, but doesn't necessarily try to influence their policies, right? We say you can still have economic growth and not necessarily try to influence the politics of be something regional, right, which costs much, much less money than in the status quo, right? But also we think that as so far as China does try to militarily expand in the region, that's often to extract resources, right? We think they already do that in the status quo as much as they possibly can without facing massive international backlash. So that means that they're not going to go much farther than that, right? No. Okay, the second thing they say is, oh, it's better for the economy, more trade deals, economic growth, etc. So what we say is, first of all, it doesn't go back to the rural people in those areas, but also we say that, they say, for example, okay, that leads to democratization on the long term, etc., that kind of stuff. We say that's not true at all, right? We say, in the worst case, what is probably going to happen is that the idea of, for example, China making sacrifices by, for example, exerting soft power, that kind of stuff, actually creates the idea that China doesn't have to have, for example, good internal policies, good working conditions, has to work against climate change, that kind of stuff, right? The moment that the government can use the message of we have to make sacrifices because we have to keep exerting our influence, that is exactly when democratization does not happen in the richer areas, right? That is exactly when democratization also doesn't happen in the poorer areas who start to develop, right? We say that is exactly the way for the Chinese government to legitimize all the terrible things they do inside of their own country because they say we have to be a global superpower towards the rest. Close.
In a phenomenon commonly known as China's economic miracle, 500 million Chinese people have been lifted out of poverty since Mao Zedong. How is it plausible that the Chinese government just doesn't give anything to the rural poor?
Look, it's a comparative, right? We say that on our side of the house, much more people are going to be lifted out of poverty because companies have an incentive to go there, right? Also what we say is that political expansionism is something that has been quite new, right? We think that in the past, very often China was very focused on their own country, very focused on getting that into a higher GDP. That is when the companies, for example, were in those rural areas, were lifting people out of poverty, and were actually creating new infrastructure in those rural areas, right? We say the moment that they started doing this political expansionism, that is when Africa became attractive. That is when Southeast Asia became attractive, right? That is the moment that these companies started shifting towards these other places, which makes it much, much harder for these companies to get infrastructure. Really short about international backlash, right? We think this is more than just, ooh, the UN gets angry, right? This is countries like the USA who have become increasingly more aggressive towards China, right? We see the electorate of these countries seeing that China is pretty much explicitly trying to influence other countries and therefore reacting in two ways. First of all, directly trying to economically harm China, right? Through, for example, tariffs, through, for example, trade wars like we see Trump doing in the first place, right? And then they'll say, Trump is an irrational actor. No. The reason that Trump was elected in the first place is because China does these kind of policies, right? And we say people who want to do these kind of things are more likely to get elected more often at the time that this happens, right? But second of all, we say it's not just directly, but it's also the USA trying to invest more into Africa, trying to invest more into Southeast Asia, therefore making those countries more economically viable for their own Western companies, right? That means they're no longer going to China because they don't see that as a threat on our side of the house. What they're trying to do is compete with the Chinese companies in those African countries and in those Southeast Asian countries, which means that in the end, the prices for example, the actual Chinese companies themselves are also less good, right? So we say that is also a harm in itself because we see that they're much more aggressive towards them. So what do we say in the end? We say, look, rural China is much more likely to get investment in this way, right? By cheap labor, by exporting goods, etc. It's not that the Chinese government doesn't give any fucks about the rural area or whatever on our side of the house. We say comparatively, they're less likely to care if they can keep their wealthy population happy by explaining away the economic growth that they have, the more global influence that they have, the increased self-power that they have, right? We say that is much more likely to happen on their side of the house. But second of all, we say access to jobs, to new labor markets, to new infrastructure, to hospitals, to water, right? We say this isn't about welfare handouts, like the second government speaker says. It's about actual companies going there and actually creating access for jobs and creating that kind of stuff, right? We say right now, the money goes back to the richest, most elitist group, right? To, for example, people who are in the party, for example, or just richer, highly educated people, right? They say you can specialize, and that's a good thing. We say that's exactly the problem, right? That specialization means that more highly educated people who would have already had jobs on your side of the house, who would have already been able to get money on your side of the house, those are the people that are benefiting on your side of the house, right? We say that is not the majority of China, that is not the majority of the people that we want to help. That is not what we stand for. We say when the promise was made of economic growth on their side of the house, that was a promise to a very select group of people people, a promise to people who had access, for example, to the political party. That is not the majority of Chinese people. That is not the majority of the most vulnerable people who we should care about, because they are actually people who need help in China from the Chinese government the most. We say those are the people we care about. Vote opening up.
I'd like to hand it over to the opposition for their speech and invite the government member to take the floor.
In the announcement of the most recent 5-year plan, Xi Jinping cracked down on corruption in the CCP, and that crackdown led to the eradication of corruption that was leaching billions and billions of Chinese yuan to the hands of the Chinese people. That is only possible when the Chinese government pursues a policy of regional expansionism that forces the CCP to make its state-owned enterprises more transparent so they can engage in trade deals and convince other countries to invest in them. And that's what will bring you a closing government. Firstly, to complete the attack on opening opposition, the first thing to note about their argument that China doesn't reinvest in its rural poor is foolish for a number of reasons. First, state-owned enterprises are responsible for the vast majority of investment overseas. Their profits are owned by the government. It's very likely those profits are reinvested. And regional expansionism gives China the precise economic incentive to engage in the rural poor, because by making them more economically productive, the size of China's economy grows and it becomes more effective at levying the sort of soft power against foreign incumbents that it does already. Secondly, China currently encourages foreign direct investment in the Chinese economy because it can use its soft power, which it pursues through regional expansionism, to get rid of things like tariffs, which other Southeast Asian countries impose upon exports, for instance, which is why it's more likely that you get foreign direct investment in China from global corporations when you can use its soft power to get rid of the restrictions that those other countries currently place upon foreign investment, which prevents that investment from occurring. Finally, it increases the quality of jobs in China because you can now conduct your heavy manufacturing overseas, and those state-owned enterprises can make a very large profit because it's less expensive to do business overseas because wages might be lower. And those large profit margins can be reinvested into higher technology jobs, which is currently transforming the Chinese economy from one that is primarily based around heavy manufacturing to things like high-tech industries. Firstly, on why this maintains the stability of the CCP. We would note that the stability of the Chinese Communist Party is important for 3 reasons. First, it means that the Chinese Communist Party has a greater willingness to engage in democracy and to democratize local governments, for instance, which is the benefit that opening government wants to get at, because it means that it is more confident in doing so when it knows it has a greater hold on power. Secondly, it avoids internal power struggles which fracture the CCP and would lead to downfall of the country, because the CCP is currently fractionalized between 2 groups of princelings like Xi Jinping and people who belong to the old guard, who perceive people like Xi Jinping to not be in a legitimate position of power, and that internal power struggle is likely to lead to things like inefficiencies in government, which lead to the collapse of the government of that country. And finally, because the opposition in China is unreliable and unlikely to be able to engage in the vast project of economic development that is the sole realm of the CCP. How do we get the stability? Firstly, fulfilling the promise of increasing international legitimacy through hegemonic acts like trying to increase soft power and the creation of a cult of personality around Xi Jinping as the person who is able to bring that legitimacy and respect back to China is precisely the thing that the CCP has been able to do as a result of its policy of regional expansionism. But secondly, because it's an excuse, and a very convenient excuse, to quell power struggles. Because Xi Jinping can now claim, I need to be the one in a unique position of power to engage in a process of foreign expansionism that only I can control and that I am responsible for. Or the CCP as a whole can claim that legitimacy to power to Chinese people, which is how we guarantee the stability of the CCP. Secondly, on economic stability, firstly, this has led to the stamping out of corruption in China, which has helped with the economic miracle that has lifted millions of people out of poverty. How is that? Firstly, it means that Chinese governments need to increase the legitimacy of its state-owned enterprises, which currently are responsible for the vast majority of foreign investment in other countries. Because it needs to do so in order to convince other businesses in order to let that investment into their country. Yeah, other countries are extremely unlikely to want corrupt businesses, which they know will funnel money out of that country willy-nilly. They are more likely to allow companies that are transparent into those countries. Secondly, you need to comply with the terms of international trade organizations like the World Trade Organization, which enforce standards of transparency upon things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the precise reason that China has gone from a shadow banking system that has funneled billions of dollars to different places around the world to one that clearly demarcates where that money has come from and where that money is going. Thirdly, you need to promote good governance in order to fulfill the purpose of regional expansionism. Because when China goes out and it tells one of its SOEs to build a mine in an African country, it needs to know that that mine will be built successfully, and it needs to know that that mine will be operated in a way that is profitable, and that is only possible when you ensure that corruption does not exist in those corporations, for the reason that it is far more likely that things like cronyism lead to the awarding of contracts to parties that do not deserve it, or the bleaching of profits to private individuals. Why is this important? I'll note that, again, literally 0 points of information, yeah? So, okay, go for it.
So what you're saying is that more trade agreements are beneficial for companies in China to begin with. Even though that is to some extent true, it only to the extent where their market focus is only on these countries in which they're investing, not back in China itself. That is the big issue that you're facing.
Look, I have literally responded to this argument 3 times in the first minute of my speech. They have an incentive to reinvest in the local economy because that helps them fulfill the goal of regional expansionism. So that is a swing and a miss. Why is this important? Firstly, it increases the efficiency of businesses so that they can hire more workers domestically. Transparent businesses are more likely to hire individuals in ways that are less prone to things like cronyism. It means they have far greater amounts of profits to reinvest into building more factories locally and internationally. Secondly, it means there's more reinvestment in local populations when billions and billions of dollars are not being lost to things like cronyism and bribery within local governance. And thirdly, it leads to better local governance for the Chinese people, because when people who work for SOEs are less willing to engage in things like bribery because they know that the Chinese government has an incentive to crack down on it, it means that they're less likely to be awarded contracts when they do not deserve it, for instance, which means that the level of services and the level of development that the Chinese people receive is far better. Finally, but for this policy, the Chinese government would be shut out of international institutions. The US already engages in a program of regional expansionism, and it will continue to use pre-existing links to other countries, the fact that it controls bodies like the World Trade Organization, using its voting power to shut China out of regional investment, and because the likely alternatives are not likely to be credible. It's not like Southeast Asian countries are going to believe China when it threatens to invade because of the promise of the US coming to its defense. This is the only way in which you get China buy-in into the international institutions which hold power over individuals, which allow China into the World Trade Organization so it can begin to negotiate trade deals with other countries. And this is precisely the policy that allows the CCP to do that, we propose.
I'd like to thank the members of government for their speech and invite the member of
Opening government cannot defend any form of Chinese expansionism that they want. Rather, they have to defend the current approach of the Chinese government in political expansionism. And unfortunately, a lot of the information that they have about how projects like the One Belt, One Road initiative operate are a little bit outdated. The One Belt, One Road initiative is no longer focused on creating debt traps to African countries and South Asian countries that can never be paid back. Rather, the current form of the One Belt, One Road, which has shifted in the past couple years, is rather in the form of extending gifts to these countries, creating infrastructure where it never gets repaid and there is no expectation. In fact, in China, there is huge backlash against some of these projects because while China faces its own debt crisis some Western countries and some in East Asia that instead lowers regulations around labor rights, around the environment, and it leaves their tariffs intact. So in fact, CG just completely gets the economic ecosystem wrong at the point where they think that political expansionism leads to more of these goals, rather than creating an economic environment where China is able to negotiate lower protections for things like IP theft, environment, labor, etc., while increasing the amount of tariffs that they have. They also say that these profits will be reinvested into helping the Chinese people. But again, we've shown that a lot of these are free gifts, essentially, building infrastructure in countries that will never pay it back in order to create future political diplomacy. Chinese people are already very upset with this because, again, they face things like a huge debt crisis, because they face things like corruption on the city and the provincial level, and they don't want this money being given away, right? Especially at the point where there's like rural issues and other things like that. Furthermore, because we think that tensions are going to be increasing some more bad governance and that's the ability to cooperate with the international order. I'm going to deal with some of the OG stuff about OBOR because we think it's actually quite bad for the Chinese people. So this, again, the stuff that they said seemed true 2 years ago, but it's not viable in the current situation because, again, African countries don't want to be massively in debt. The leaders can see Sri Lanka. They can see ghost town apartments in Angola. They have called China a new colonizer, right? They're refusing to take these sort of loans and debt traps that happened in the past, and instead, the loans have been frozen, and now we're turning towards these gifts that are decreasing the amount of money that can be reinvested within China. Instead, many countries are taking loans that they can't repay, having China build some for free, etc. The impact here is that the Chinese domestics are furious because the money is being given away. This damages CCP stability. The biggest threat to the CCP right now is not any sort of foreign threat, but rather the ability of the Chinese people to create mass unrest for migrant workers to say we don't have any jobs, our working conditions are terrible, and to riot against the CCP itself. Because all of these are internal threats, the government, the political expansionist activities are massively hurting the single thing that gave the Chinese people credibility. All of the CCP's credibility came from the ability to rise up and create economic growth in the first place by putting China first before all the rest of the globalization initiatives. So now that these investments are productive, they're hurting the whole economy. So what is our extension going to be about? First, I'll just open it.
Is China more likely to continue on its trajectory toward democracy on our side when it needs to maintain its image to other states, or on your side when the People's Liberation Army gains greater strength because only they can promise to restore China's international power?
So China doesn't need to curry favor with states that are really requiring democracy. As we've seen, the states that are pressuring China most towards democracy, like the U.S., China simply abandoned and created its own economic systems with states that have more purely economic interests and therefore propagating China as a global leader of a different trade bloc. So our extension is going to be about why we think a trade war is highly likely and how that will damage the Chinese people. First of all, it's already occurred. But second of all, what are the causes of this, right? A lot of this has to do with things like refusal to join the TPP and cyber attacks on foreign governments and foreign companies, information warfare campaigns that emphasize Chinese influence and target other governments, stealing information, both IP theft as well as private government information. No, thank you. These cyber attacks and information warfare complaints, first of all, are very likely to escalate into a cyber war. The miscalculation is extremely likely in the digital realm because, first of all, you are unable to assign fault because actors are extremely unclear, which means whether state or non-state actors invites retaliation very quickly. This retaliation is really fast because everything happens in an instant. And currently the most valuable assets like military design, social media, and information control, as seen by like Russian campaigns, are currently all online. Second of all, cyber wars are really bad. No, thank you. International trade agreements become impossible at this point. For example, you can see how sanctions on South Korea after South Korea got mad about cyber attacks on one of its grocery store chains. As a result of that, led to shutting down the supermarket chain in China, which is a huge creator of jobs and source of grocery stores and stuff for the people, as well as fully damaged cooperation between South Korea and China. We think these things are likely to escalate, which prevent the ability to have productive trade agreements. This is going to affect both the U.S. and the West, which we already see, as well as members of their current trade deals, by making it impossible to cooperate, in addition to resulting in digital protectionism, which turns their democracy thing by limiting the amount of information accessible to Chinese people. Furthermore, these trade wars are really, really bad because Chinese people face economic concerns around jobs, around spending, access to resources. These effects are really bad because, first of all, when you have tariffs, everything becomes really, really expensive, especially for rural people living on the margins. Small businesses and such are unable to cope and grow at this point. This also kills industries that are no longer competitive when you're unable to form trade agreements with other companies
government wanted to bring economic prosperity to the people of China. Closing government wanted to bring a rules-based order and stability to the people of China. We are willing to agree on closing opposition that all of these things would be good for the Chinese people. But we've been the first team in the round to show you how both of these teams actively hurt the interest that they are trying to promote in the policy that they are trying to pursue. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, talk about how their policy through One Belt, One Road, which is what opening government mostly wanted to defend, would cause an economic crisis and deeply hurt the Chinese people. Second, when we talk about closing government and how their policy would eject China from a rules-based order and make it harder for them to get the kind of agreements that they wanted. Let's talk about the economy first. Opening opposition said that we should spend money on the rural poor instead of in Africa and Asia. We're willing to agree with that, but there's a fair criticism from government that we can't necessarily dictate exactly how this money will be spent. We made the far stronger claim that it would be better if this money was not spent at all, i.e. China is literally throwing away money by pursuing the One Belt, One Road project. For context, China's debt is currently 250% of its GDP. Debt is growing faster than the GDP. The burden is becoming more and more onerous. Meanwhile, as closing government helpfully tells us, the Chinese government is also throwing away money through blatant corruption. We think that their side of the house makes all of these problems worse and makes it impossible for China to avoid an economic crisis, which directly hurts the most vulnerable people in the country. Even if China spends no more money on the rural poor on our side of the house, at least we are avoiding a crisis that makes their lives much, much worse at the point where they cannot afford access to basic services. Why do they cause this to happen? Why do they cause a horrible economic disaster? First of all, the opening government wants to literally throw money away. I'm sorry, closing government, but the pie is not expanding, so you can't just say you're going to reinvest all of the money that we are magically getting. Their arguments about One Belt, One Road seemed true 2 years ago, but it's increasingly true that debt trap diplomacy is not viable. People are marching in the streets of poor African countries like Zambia and Angola, carrying signs that say China equals Hitler. They hate that their Chinese employers are racist and don't employ African workers or treat them extremely poorly. China has, in the past 6 months, frozen interest-bearing aid to Africa because they know that countries are unable to repay the loans, and they don't want that. It doesn't mean just when China engages in this kind of diplomacy that they get non-ideal assets. It is literally self-defeating as a project, leads to massive amounts of domestic unrest. This is true because African countries and Southeast Asian countries do not want to be massively in debt. They know what's going on, they see China as a new colonizer, and they do not want this to be their project. So, no thank you. So what is happening with this project? All of the loans and aid that China now gives to Southeast Asia, or most of them, and Africa, now have to be grants and free things because governments have caught on to the debt traps. Even the loans that are given often cannot be repaid. China has forgiven something like $10 billion in African debt in the past decade. That is an incredible burden on the Chinese economy. And the impact of this is incredibly true. So one reason that they're going to face an economic crisis is because they were throwing money away through these kinds of projects. Not clear they're gaining anything for themselves besides empty apartment complexes. Second thing, no thanks, is that they are directly provoking other states and jeopardizing the possibility of agreements with them. No one in this round until our team talked about the fact that an important way in which China intervenes in the politics of other states is via directly cyber attacking those countries. I think that's incredibly damaging, and it's something they're likely to continue to do if they adopt the approach that's advocated for by the government teams. And no, this is not just about the United States. No, this is not a temporary thing that China can wait out. And no, China does not have sufficient power such that South Korea wouldn't dare to not trade with China, right? Because even if they have to cop a huge economic disadvantage, you can't strike a trade deal with a country that is cyber attacking you. That is just not going to be in the political interest of your people. They will never allow that. What does this mean? It means that for a lot of reasons, one being a debt explosion and the inability to spend money on any of its people, whether rural or urban, and two, because of increasing, escalating economic tensions between China and other countries, it's just going to be true that imports will be more expensive for the average person. They will not be able to afford access to basic services. And if you want to help the rural poor, whether you're going to spend money on them or not, you have to at least make sure that they have access to basic needs. So even if the counterfactual isn't giving money to them, the fact that we are spending this money at all directly harms those people. As opening opposition helpfully said, they are the vast majority of the people in China, and they are also the most vulnerable. I think we already take the debate on this point. Yeah, I'll take over.
even a gift of infrastructure creates a sense of obligation and forces other countries to stay close to China to keep those gifts. But you never dealt with the relevant alternative, military expansionism, which has all of the costs, but none of the benefits like export and natural resource access.
So, first of all, I don't think the gifts are paying off. I don't think China has the money to give away to promote this soft idea of a country liking you vaguely more. They never explained on opening government why giving someone a bridge was the tipping point at which they became willing to accept other things of you doing stuff in the region. We think these dependent relationships already exist. Second, they never explain why military intervention, first, is the necessary alternative, or second, why it's not also on their side, right? Because we think a lot of the sort of things that they actually should have been defending on opening government are at least semi-military in nature, right? Things like aggression on islands, things like cyber attacks, which we were the first team to tell you about. I think opening government ultimately ran away from the burden of this debate, but they also defended something that was just a bad idea, so I think they're not going to be in the round. Let's talk about closing government then. They basically think that it's a good idea for China to be a part of the rules-based order. We agree that this is probably a good thing. We told you that their policy directly makes this impossible. They said that it will make the Chinese Communist Party more stable, that China will become more rules-based, and will be participating in more institutions. Why does this not work? We just think that this is absurd on face, and the opposite of all of this is true. Guys, direct interference in other countries is not a good way to participate in the international system. Cyber attacks are not a good way to get other countries to strike trade deals with you, and debt traps make it impossible for you to ever get economically involved in countries in the future at all. All of this stuff makes you less likely to strike deals with other countries, more likely to have trade wars, more likely to be isolated from the kinds of institutions that closing government wanted to talk about. But even on a domestic level, because they also talked about domestic stability and democratization, both of the government teams. But at the point where the Chinese citizens themselves do not want China to be throwing away money to other countries because they are smart people and recognize that it directly trades off with their own interests, we think you are far more likely to get the revolution in the streets that opening government was so worried about. We think you're more likely to get unrest, cracking down, and that sort of thing. If you want to stable China, you've got to stop spending money on other countries. Very, very proud to oppose.